So thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. I think I've been to every frog up to now, but I've not presented at every frog, and this is my first keynote here, so I'm pretty happy to be there. And as I was talking to my colleagues back on the table, it's a good opportunity to be the first because everything I say is new for this conference. I'm going to throw around a lot of ideas and theories and hope that's okay as a beginning of a conference. So with some of them, I won't go too much into depth, but I just want to present one train of thought that I think might be an interesting addition to the discussions we're going to have today and tomorrow. Yeah, so maybe just a little bit about my background, which is also very much related to my research. I'm currently not working at the university, but I have been doing research on video games from a cultural anthropological point of view. And I've been conducting a lot of qualitative interviews with players, but as well with teachers and parents or people around players in order to understand what function these games have in the lives of the people that play them. So I always try to find the relation between the motivation to play video games and the question of what does that tell us about society, that these motivations or these urges, these longings are pushed into the digital spaces, because I think that there's a lot of political and societal implications there. So this is one of the bases of my work. A second one is that I'm working for an NGO called Ludovico, which is focusing on all different sorts of play. As you can see in the background of this photo, we also have a big board game library. And 2 afternoons every week, people have the opportunity to come to that board game library and to play digital games. So this is a great opportunity for me to be there when people play, especially young people, kids, teenagers, families. And sometimes I play along with them, but sometimes I'm just there listening to how they communicate, what they do, what they think, what they talk about when they play these games. And this is helping a lot as participant observations for my scientific work also. And another part of my work at Ludovico is organizing the annual Festival of Gaming Culture in Graz, the Button Festival. And this is a festival where we try to invite local gaming communities to come to Graz, to come to the event, to present themselves, to exchange ideas, and so on and so forth. So we see ourselves as those who provide the platform, but it's the local communities that fill this platform with content. And this, of course, again, is a great opportunity for me to get in touch with very different parts of the gaming community. It's about esports, it's about retro gaming and collecting games. It's also about cosplay and about game development, and all of these different aspects come together there. And of course, give the people who are there, but also give me a good impression of what is going on in this huge and diverse world of gaming at the moment. So, as I said, one of my main research questions was, why do people play? Especially because there's still a lot of stigmatization going on around video games, and it's a hobby that takes up a lot of time and a lot of money. So why would people invest it? And I thought that there must be interesting answers there, because there's quite a lot to invest. And throughout all of these different aspects of my work, but especially, of course, in my interviews, what came up again and again and again were different forms of a longing for agency. I think this is not very surprising for us thinking about games, because what makes video games unique compared to other entertainment media is this possibility of agency within the medium. So we can decide how we want to play, how we want to do it. We progress in the game through interacting with it. But what I found was that different social groups, people from different backgrounds had different reasons for, to play video games, but they very often were somehow connected to a very strong urge to feel powerful, to feel relevant, and to feel their own agency. And I want to give you one first idea of what I'm talking about there, talking about young people, talking about teenagers. I guess that some of you will remember the time when Fortnite was swallowed by a black hole. This was a I would argue was a PR stunt by Epic Games. The world of Fortnite disappeared in a black hole, and it was gone for around 1.5 days. It was the change of Fortnite seasons, but there was no information out there when the game would return or if it would return. Of course, for the younger players, this was not totally clear if the game would come back. And within these 1.5 days, I had a young man at Ludovico at our board game library, and we were talking about video games and streaming and the opportunities of streaming. And he said that he'd been playing a lot of Fortnite the last months and weeks. And at some point, he suddenly said, I hope the game just never returns. I hope we can go on to playing something else now. I'm only there because everybody else is. And I think for people working with teenagers playing video games, this is not very surprising, but it shows very clearly that it's not always that much about the games. Especially teenagers often don't play the games they love the most, but they play the games where everybody else is, where they get the opportunity to meet their friends, where they get the opportunities to meet their peers. And this cannot be very surprising if we look at the research on youth culture throughout the last decades, because from the late 1970s onwards, 1980s, 1990s, and so on, the research has always been warning us that young people are losing their freedoms, they're losing spaces that they can interact with freely, and their life worlds are being narrowed down by rules and by observation of adults. And if I ask, when I ask young people in my workshops why they play video games, then the first answer, of course, always is, well, because it's fun. But when I try to dig deeper, then I often get this answer that somehow tells me, well, it's a place where parents and teachers are not, and where I can meet my friends without being observed and without having to follow their rules. So to bring up a quote from just one researcher in this field, Benedikt Sturzenegger, he wrote more than 20 years ago, their world is being paved with warning signs and rules of behavior before they get a chance to make their own experiences with it. So young people, teenagers are being told that this is the time of their life where they have to decide who they want to be, what they want to be, and the directions in which they want to develop, but they don't get the freedom to do it. So while many people think the video games are the reason for them not to play freely, I argue it's mainly the other way around. They use the video games because there they have some sorts of freedom and some sorts of agency that they don't experience in many parts of their everyday life world. So there is a strong focus on the individual and a strong focus on agency. And I think that's not very surprising. That's something pretty natural when it comes to human beings. We like to feel effective in the things we do. But I would also argue that there has been throughout modernity, so throughout the last centuries, but especially throughout the last decades, there have been a lot of developments that put the individual more and more into the focus of the way we see the world and we see humanity. We could argue that it all started with the Enlightenment that pushed aside mythological explanations of the world and put the human and the human ability to critically and rationally explain the world more and more into the center. This could also be said about humanism. Humanism is a very, there are many different forms of humanism, but they're all somehow connected to a very optimistic understanding of the human being. And it's very much about seeing the potential of the human to decide whatever they want to be and to shape the world in a way that they, to explain the world for themselves, but also to shape the world and to use the world. And there's a lot of good criticism out there at the moment in post-humanist thinking, where they connect this humanist idea of the human, of us, of our ways of interacting with the world to the Anthropocene and to the climate catastrophe that we're in at the moment, because we didn't think enough about the other actors in the field. We just focused on the humans there. But as I said, these are examples from the last centuries, but it gets more interesting in the last decades. especially, of course, if we think about present-day neoliberalism that has been called data capitalism or surveillance capitalism. So that is based on these new networked possibilities of society, and that is very strongly focused on the individual and on well, telling the individual to improve itself as good as possible, not just to simply fit into the labor market, but to be as good a citizen as is possible. So I would argue that what neoliberalism has been working up to or developing into throughout the last decades is that it has been sipping into every part of our everyday lives and into things that have formerly been considered to be private. So it's telling us to keep healthy, to do our sport. It gives us opportunities to meet the right people, to have romantic or erotic relationships. Every part of our life is somehow interfered with by this system, and the system tries to sell us things that could help us to improve ourselves, because the main narrative is that if you improve yourself, if you're disciplined enough, then you will succeed in life. And if you don't succeed in life, then it's about you because you didn't try hard enough. And all of this has somehow been summed up by the French sociologist Marc Augé. Many of you might know him because he's the one who came up with this theory of the non-places. And this whole theory of the non-places is based on this idea of the supermodernity. He says that he doesn't like the term of the post-modernity because we never left modernity. He said that modernity has just been accelerating itself over the last decades. And it's now moving at a pace where it's almost impossible for us to keep up and to grasp it. And he says that we're living in a time where the way we understand the world is always based on the past, because society and the way the world works has already been moving onwards. So we never have the feeling, the right feeling of the world we live in, because it's always moving faster than we can understand it. And his idea of supermodernity is based on three basic principles or aspects. He says that there is an excess of time, an excess of space, and an excess of individuality. And what he means by that is that in this excess of time, he means that there are so many things happening at the same time within our fields of perception that it's impossible for us to think of all of them, but still we somehow feel the need to know about most of them if somehow possible. And that is strongly related to this excess of space, that we can watch things that are happening halfway around the globe at the moment. And we can, even if we have the financial means, be there within 24 hours. So the whole world lies open for us, which also means that we have to decide what we do with these opportunities. And this is where the excess of individuality comes in. We're offered with so many options of what we want to be and how we want to be, or if we shouldn't change our way of life and be somebody different, that it's just too much for us to grasp. But at the same time, we're living in a system that encourages us to think about ourselves and what we want to be and how we want to be and how we want to present ourselves, and where we could maybe work on ourselves to be a bit better in some way of our life or some aspect of our life all the time. So neoliberalism is, in the way we are experiencing it now, is very much focusing on us and as individuals. And at the same time, there's an overload of possibilities of what we could be or what we should be in this world. So there's this very strong focus on the individual there. And there's, I think, very helpful and highly interesting theory of Wendy Hugh Chun. I don't know if many of you have read her. If you didn't, I highly encourage you to do so. She's a network theorist and thinks about the impacts of these networked neoliberalist societies on our daily lives. And she says one main characteristic from her point of view is that it's all about you. So what these systems do is they tell us it's about you. I understand you. I adapt in order to give you what you need. And we all know it from online algorithms. They even suggest that they know what we want better than we know it ourselves. But if you look at the title of the book that I highly encourage you to read, it's called Updating to Remain the Same. So one major part of her theory is that in order to stay the same within these societies, we need to be in a constant process of updating ourselves. So it's not just about you, but it's about new. This is her own play of words there. And she says that if you want to stay being the person that you are at the moment, you need to be improving and updating all the time. And this is very clear if you think about your presence in social media platforms. If you're just there, then after some time you won't be there anymore. You need to be updating your profile. You need to be adding new content to what you're doing there. And you even need to understand the current fashions of internet culture in order to keep up with the flow and keep being relevant within this system. But as many of you probably will have thought about by now, it's of course not just about you, but it's about you and you and you and you, and everybody amongst us is treated pretty much in the same way by these systems. For them, we're just data, stacks of data that tell them how to interact with us. But still, they're very much based on giving us the idea that we as individuals are very special and that it's really about us. And they try to give us this very special experience, even though it's doing the same thing to everybody else. So to translate all of this into gaming language and to help people as you to understand what Wendy Hugh Kyung is talking about, we could also argue that it's about you and about you and about you and about you. And each and every one amongst them has the feeling that it was their very own and very individual adventure that they experienced in The Witcher 3. And of course, we see the differences between these different forms of Geralt of Rivia. But after all, it's just a few data points that changed according to your way to play the game. And all of the rest has been the same to everybody else. But still, what this game does very well, I suppose, is to give you the idea that it is your adventure and you saved this world, and you saved it according to your own ideas and according to your own individuality. And that's something beautiful video games can do, but it's, as I argue and as you see now, very strongly related to the way this networked world works at the moment. As a little side note, of course, these characters also give us a hint towards another group that I think is very relevant when we think about using digital spaces and digital games in order to experience agency that we can't experience elsewhere, which is the heterosexual men that experience themselves not to be as powerful as they should be or as they're being told that they are. So I guess most of you who have been following video game discourse and political video game discourse throughout the last years, you're aware of this, that there's quite a loud group of men who didn't experience themselves to be as powerful as they're being told they are by feminist criticism. So they're being told you are men, so you're powerful within this society, but they experience themselves not to be very powerful at all. And they used games for a long time now in order to have a place where they can be dominant, where they can be aggressive, where they can be masculine in a certain way or form that is connected to their ideal of masculinity. And when feminist criticism finally reached those gaming spaces, we all know what happened. We had very strong, very aggressive, very hateful reactions of this group in order to defend their chance to get this opportunity to feel this form of masculine agency within these games. So this is just another example I want to give you there. So coming back to Wendy Hugh Kyung-Chun's theory, I guess many of you might have seen this movie. It's the movie Her, and it's about this guy falling in love with an AI. It's the AI that runs all of his systems. It's very much inspired by Siri, I guess. So it's a talking AI that runs all of his systems. And he falls in love with it because this AI seems to understand the way he thinks, seems to add to his life in a meaningful way and give him a lot of things to think about, but at the same time give him the feeling that he's very special. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to spoil the movie for you now. So if you don't want that, just close your ears for 10 or 15 seconds. It all ends up with him realizing that the same AI is having the same romantic relationship with millions of users around the world, which seems very natural for the AI, but it breaks the deal for him because he realizes that he's not that special after all, but there's so many people that have had the same wonderful experiences with that AI. And I think this is the perfect metaphor for what when Yu Chun tries to tell us. Everybody of us, amongst us, gets this feeling to be very special, but in the end, it's working pretty much the same way for everybody else who's using these systems. So let's have a roundup of what I've said up to now in a very pessimistic way. We could argue that what present-day neoliberalism is promising us is that if we jump into the river, if you put ourselves into the state of flow, if we try to improve all the time, work hard on us, then we will keep on improving, we will keep on getting in better and better positions in our lives, we will have happy lives, we will have beautiful wives, we will have beautiful homes, and at some point we will end up in a position where we are in a position of power and we are able to decide about other people and about the way this world should develop. But what the system, of course, does not like to tell us is that it's very much about privileges and that it's very clearly it's very clearly based on a patriarchal idea of society. So it's closely connected to one ideal of masculinity. And if the further you're away from that ideal, and of course, the further you're away from classic social privileges, the harder it will be for you to really get into this flow of everyday life. So into this flow of self-improvement and moving up the power structures of social systems. But at the same time, what the systems offers us is this semi-real digital world where everybody else can still make the same experiences. Because if we're honest about it, most of the video games we play are very clearly built on neoliberal structures of self-improvement, of improving certain stats of our character in order to get stronger, in order to get more powerful. And this is built to be an endless chain. And this is not very surprising because Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who is the father of the flow theory, was a Hungarian born in a socialist or communist country. And he tried to develop his theory of flow as a counter narrative to the Marxist idea of reclaiming the means of production and of uniting as a social class. He said that capitalism does not want people to think in these terms of social classes. So he said, we need a narrative that tells people that it's worth the while working on improving the individual, yourself as an individual in order to move on in life. And this is where flow theory comes from. And it's pretty much the way it works, because if you think about being in the flow, one thing that is connected to it, even though we tend to see it as a very positive thing. One part of being in the flow is that we don't really get out and think about what's happening at the moment, but we just keep on going with the flow. So let's take one step back from there. One thing I say in pretty much every of my talk, wherever I hold them, is that when we play video games, we have to be able to be inside and outside of the game at the same time. So of course, there's this idea and this ideal of immersion, but Salen and Zimmerman already wrote about this immersive fallacy, that this is not true, that we want to be fully immersed in the game. But what we want is to be able to experience the game world in a bodily manner. That's the part of us that is in the game world. But at the same time, parts of our consciousness have always been able to be outside of the game, thinking about the rules, thinking about the possibilities we get within these games, and of course, very physically translating what we want to do in the games into movements on the keyboard or on the controller, and so on and so forth. So it's not possible to be fully immersed, because then you wouldn't be able to play the game. And as I have argued up to now, moving into these semi-digital worlds is very strongly related to power structures. It's related to structures that tell us that we as individuals are responsible for building up to be the best person that we can be. And if we don't succeed at that, then it's our own fault. And this is one part of pushing us into digital worlds, especially, as I said, if you're not as privileged, if you don't have the starting conditions to really be in the flow of the system, then it's very interesting to get into these digital worlds because they enable everybody to make these experiences. And that's pretty exactly what Michel Foucault would call heterotopias. Heterotopias are a counterpart to the utopia. So utopia is a place that does not exist and that we make up in our minds, while a heterotopia is a place that does exist, but that is somehow disconnected from everyday life and works in different ways. So things that are not considered normal in everyday life could be normal within the heterotopia, and people who might not be powerful within everyday life could experience themselves as being powerful within the heterotopia for a certain amount of time. And this, I believe, is where oppression and freedom come together, because for Michel Foucault, it is impossible to separate these two from each other. We had these discussions yesterday in the workshop about the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation to play games. It's almost impossible to tell them apart, because of course, we choose to play video games, but many people, to use my examples, choose to play video games in reaction to the possibilities they find outside of the digital worlds. So it's not just their free will, it's also the power structures pushing them there. So let's move on to the game scholar Jesper Juhl, that I guess some of you or many of you might know, who says that digital games are half real. Playing games is a half real activity. And I'm quite critical about this terminology because it still sticks to this idea of real and unreal, while I think that most of us would argue that video games expand our reality, but they don't introduce us to a new form of reality. But it's still very helpful if we want to understand what is happening there in the social and in the cultural aspect, or in the cultural way. And one part of Jesper Juhl's theory that seems to be very interesting for me and my thinking about games is that he says, the great thing about video games is that we get to decide how real and how serious we want it to be. And we can turn that up and down. Even while we're in the game, we can decide, okay, now get more serious about it. We really try to win this now. So just think about the example, maybe I would be a soccer player at the World Cup at the moment, and I use the championship games to practice my tricks and do beautiful things with the ball, but every now and then I lose the ball, and after all, we lose the game. Then my teammates might come up and tell me, you don't understand how serious this is. This is the championship. This is what we need to win, so you're not taking it serious enough. And if I play the same game of soccer at the local family barbecue and I cut down my 6-year-old son in order to get the ball and use all of my power to hit a shot on the goal where the 4-year-old daughter of my neighbor is standing trying to be the goalkeeper, then people will tell me the very opposite thing. They will tell me, hey, don't be so competitive about it. It's just a game. We're just trying to have fun here. It's the same game, but as a community playing a game, we need to come to pretty much the same understanding of how real we want it to be. And that is a beautiful possibility that we have when we play games, even while we're playing them. So think about people losing games. They try to tell you, yeah, you know, it's just a game. It doesn't mean anything, and I didn't really try hard at all. It was just for fun. But people who win games tend to connect them winning the game to their personal skills. So they would say, yeah, you know, I'm quite a strategic thinker, so this somehow suits me. It's easy for me to understand how this game works. So they connect the game to their real life, while people who lose games tend to disconnect it from their real life. So they're turning up and down the reality volume of the game. And there's a lot of great opportunities there, as I will be coming back to a little later in the talk. So let's come back to this flow theory once more. As I said, to remain inside of the flow, you need to be in the proper mood for this kind of flow. So even here, this turning up and down the reality volume might help. But of course, there has been a lot of criticism, and good criticism, of the flow theory and its relation to video games. And one of the best books I know there is Against Flow by Braxton Soderman. And he from a critical point of view, says we need to be able, if we want to be critical citizens within neoliberal societies, we need to be able to step out of the river every now and then and take a look at where it's coming from and where it's going, and if we want to be part of it, or even about how we could change it and where else the flow could lead us. So it's a good thing to be in the flow, and it helps us to be in this cycle of improving ourselves, but we need to be able to step out of it every now and then, because as long as we're in the river, we don't see where it's going, we don't see where it's coming from, we just go along. And this is where Bertolt Brecht comes in, the German playwright who tried to change the theater at his time. Because at his time, most of the theater was trying to fully immerse the audience into the plays, in order to make them see what they're seeing as a real story and feel what the characters within this work of fiction should be feeling. And Bertolt Brecht said, no, we need to alienate the audience from the fiction, and we need to put up plays that tell people, by the way they're brought up there, that it's just a work of fiction they're seeing. Because what he thought is that this would give people the opportunity to realize that they're watching a work of fiction, which would make them think about the possibilities it could have turned out, about other ways that the story could go. So people within a work of fiction could, of course, make other decisions, work into other ways, be other people. And this helps to realize that how this world works is not something that is given, but something that has to that can be changed. And this was the very optimistic approach of Bertolt Brecht, who hoped that through this kind of theater, he could get people into thinking about the system and thinking about how to improve the systems they lived in. And as I would very strongly argue with this picture you've seen already, playing games, we can't even avoid this alienation effect. So as I said, you need to be able to be inside and outside of the game at the same time in order to play a game successfully. So you need to know that it's a work of fiction that you're interacting with. And if you have been there when people discuss digital games, then you often hear discussions about them making the games. So quite often, and this don't have to be academic discussions, but everywhere people discuss games, they say, you know, I don't know why they didn't let Link jump in the games, and why did they cut off the world here? So there's a lot of thinking about them making the game, which of course also includes the knowledge that it could be different. The system could work differently, and we could find different ways of interacting with the system. So if the optimism of Bertolt Brecht is right, then video games could be a tool to see the matrix behind the things, to see the system and to see, that's why it works like that, and maybe we could change it here in order to somehow move on into a better world. So this is a very optimistic point of my talk. Now let's step back from that optimism for a short period of time. We could say that we as game scholars and media pedagogues are the ones standing there telling the players, you know, you need to use your games to think against the narrative, be creative about it. And one of the most popular and one of the biggest things that player communities came up with was Gamergate. They thought against the narrative. There was this narrative of the social development and equality, and they thought against it and they fought against it. So they somehow lived up to this, but in a direction that we didn't want to be the outcome of this. So we could also go on saying that we as game scholars and we as media pedagogues tell people who play games that they need this playful attitude to interact with everyday life, take it out into the world. And one of the biggest things that grew out of that, I would argue, was QAnon. Where is it? There it is. Because it has been described, and I think it has been very accurately described, as an augmented reality game. What QAnon does is that it makes reality a creative game about big power structure, big problems of the world that have to be solved. And it's very much focused on the individual that follows QAnon to be smarter than everybody else, to understand the things that everybody else won't, and to see that there are big things going on that nobody likes to tell you. So it's about empowerment, it's about the individual, it's about giving people the idea that they are smarter than everybody else and they have the skills to see what is actually happening there and that there's a big cabal of pedophiles and so on and so forth. So we don't know and we can't say that everything that video games can do and the way they can bring people into thinking differently around about the worlds they live in will add up to some to something useful or something good for society. But of course, I don't want to end with this very pessimistic approach. So I want to say that there are a lot of examples out there where that actually is working and is taking place. And one of my favorite examples is the speedrunning community and especially the Games Done Quick events. These are people who have very creative ways of interacting and engaging with the media of digital games. These are people who finish Dark Souls 2 within 3 hours using only 4 of their toes, but they don't just make it, they don't just do it because it's fun and it's a playful form of interaction, but they also use it to raise millions for good causes during those Games Done Quick events, because there are people out there who love to watch this, who love to support this, and who love the caritative idea of the whole thing. So there's a very playful form of interacting with the medium used to do good in the world and to try to change things. Another example I want to give you can be summed up by the book title of Bonnie Ruberg. Video games have always been queer. And she has a very broad understanding of the term queer within, or they have a very broad understanding of the term queer within this book. Because it's all forms of changing the individual approach to life. And that's something that video games offer us in a very creative way, that we can use them in order to experiment with what we want to be, who we want to be. And this is where we come back to Jesper Juhl and this possibility of turning up and down the reality volume. I can be somebody totally else in a game and say, well, it's just for fun. I just wanted to try it out for today. But I can also use it to experiment with ways I might want to be even outside of the game. So this possibility of deciding for ourselves how real we want this to be at the moment is a great chance to use these spaces very freely and to experiment with individuality, but of course also with moral questions and many things connected to that. So to open up the scope a little bit, a colleague from Graz that especially the Austrians amongst you might probably know, Johanna Pirker, she tends to call video games empathy machines. And she says that video games have this very unique ability to offer us experiences that help us build empathy. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. And I want to focus on this term of empathy, or this idea of empathy, for the last minutes of my talk. But I believe that in order to unlock these empathy machines within the games, you need to bring a basic amount of empathy towards the game in order to be able to do that. So I want to give you a last anecdote from my work. Just a few years ago, I've been in a youth center and I've been discussing video games with a bunch of teenagers. And we were discussing the games they were actually playing at that moment. And that was one of the Call of Duty games. And within the campaign of that game, there were certain points where the narrative stopped and asked the players, how would you choose? So these were very openly moral questions of whom do you want to kill, or do you want to try to save this person but risk the life of this other person? And I built the workshop around discussing with them how they would come to conclusions given these decisions. And there was one 12 or 13-year-old within this group. And of course, he wouldn't have been allowed to play Call of Duty for the next 5 or 6 years, but he had been playing it. And he said, you know, I've been thinking about the fact that most of the shooter games we play at the moment, they're somehow based on this fight against Islamistic terrorism. And I have a lot of Muslim people, Muslim boys in my class, and I'm just wondering, how do they feel about it? How do they see that? How do they experience this pop culture narrative of fighting the dangerous Muslims in the world? And I think that this anecdote gives us a great idea of where all of this can lead to, because I believe that it is very important, very helpful, and a beautiful thing to do to build better games, to build games with good narratives that help us to interact with interesting stories and have and maybe evoke interesting moral thoughts within us. But as this example shows us and proves to us, I believe, is that if you have enough empathy, if you bring enough empathy towards the game, then even a game such as Call of Duty can become an empathy machine for you. So my final argument of this talk would be that, of course, it's a great thing and it's important to improve the way we make games and to make more critical and more diverse and more reflected games. But our main focus needs to be on the players themselves, because if we change the set of mind they bring towards the games, then they can turn pretty much every gaming experience into a valuable and worthwhile learning experience, that they can unlock the empathy machines within the games and use the empathy they have to build up on the game and improve themselves and their empathy with the game. And this, I believe, is the main tool and the main weapon, if you will, to face this pretty much individualization on speed that we're now experiencing in supermodernity. So while everything seems to be focusing more and more on the individual, empathy is the chance to move against that and come back to thinking about social groups, thinking about societies, thinking about democratic systems. And there's a lot of potential there. And it's not just about the way the games are, but it's much more about the way the players are. Thank you very much.